Okay, so this is a story about a book. And yeah, on the surface, it might seem a little dated today, maybe a bit overdramatic, but you have to understand, 250 years ago, this book didn't just find an audience, it literally set the world on fire. So we're going to dive into how a story of unrequited love became one of history's first viral sensations, and what that tells us about how stories and we work.
But first, let's start with how we see this story now. I love this. This is a real, one-star review from Goodreads for Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's cynical, it's hilarious, and it just perfectly captures how a lot of people feel today. The main character, he's just some whiny guy who got stuck in the friend zone and couldn't take a hint. And right there, that's the puzzle we're here to solve. The very same character that we might roll our eyes at and dismiss as a nice guy was once seen as a genuine cultural icon. A tragic hero whose pain felt so real, so profound, that some people were actually willing to die for him. So how on earth do we get from a world-changing phenomenon to a one-star review? That gap, that's where the real story is.
Okay, so to get why this book was such a big deal, we first have to get the story that started it all. And at its heart, the plot is shockingly simple.
It's a classic setup. We have a sensitive young artist, his name is Werther, who moves to this beautiful, idyllic village. And there, he falls completely, totally, hopelessly in love with a woman named Lot. The problem? Well, Lot is amazing, she's kind, she's charming, and she really enjoys his company. But she's already engaged to a very solid, respectable man named Albert. You can see where this is going.
The whole thing basically unfolds in three powerful stages. First, you get this passionate infatuation, where Werther's feelings just spiral into a full-blown obsession. Then, that impossible love triangle becomes permanent when Lade actually marries Albert, which traps Werther in what feels like an unbearable, painful situation. And that, of course, leads to the final stage, absolute despair, where he's so consumed by this unrequited love that he sees only one way out.
A simple story of a love triangle, right? Well, the effect of this little book, as Goethe himself called it, was anything but simple. No, it was explosive. You could say it was, for all intents and purposes, Europe's first piece of viral media.
The reaction wasn't just, hey, that was a good book. It was a full-blown cultural firestorm that people started calling Werther fever. The novel became an instant international bestseller. Young men everywhere started dressing like the hero, in his signature blue frock coat and yellow waistcoat. There was even merch. You could buy Eau de Werther perfume. But then there's the dark side. It sparked a shocking wave of copycat suicides all across Europe, with young people ending their lives in the exact same way as the protagonist.
Goethe himself was completely stunned by all of this. He later wrote that his book was like a small spark that exploded a mine full of gunpowder. He knew he hadn't created these intense feelings of despair and passion out of thin air. He gave a voice, a really powerful, poetic voice to an entire generation of young people who already felt bored, stifled, and full of what he called unsatisfied passions.
So how did a 250-year-old story manage to stay so relevant for so long and in so many different corners of the world? Well, to understand that, we need this fantastic concept from a literary scholar named Johannes Kaminski, who calls it the Werther nursery. The key idea here is something called grafting, and you can think of it just like in gardening. You take a branch from one tree, right, and you fuse it onto the trunk of a completely different tree. What you get isn't just a copy, it's a new hybrid, a whole new kind of fruit. In the exact same way, cultures took the story of Werther and grafted it onto their own social and political issues, creating totally new meanings that Goethe himself could never have even imagined.
Let's look at a quick example of this grafting in action. In late 18th century England, there was this big cultural movement called sensibility, which was all about celebrating deep, refined emotions. For those readers, especially women writers, Werther wasn't just some sad love story. No, they basically adopted it as a catechism of sensibility, like a handbook for the sensitive soul. Werther became the gold standard for the sensitive man.
And this whole process of grafting, it wasn't just a European thing. As the story traveled across the globe, it got transplanted into totally new soil, and it started sprouting into these incredible, sometimes unrecognizable new forms.
I mean, just look at this transformation. In pre-unification Italy, Werther wasn't just a heartbroken dude anymore, he was reimagined as a political exile, and his personal sorrow was a stand-in for his nation's suffering. Then you jump to 1920s China, and he becomes a revolutionary martyr, his suicide a protest against old feudal traditions. And in post-war Japan, he's seen as an existentialist hero, and his despair reflects modern alienation. It's the same story, but with completely different meanings. It's wild.
And this brings us to a really crucial insight from Kaminsky's research. The farther the story got from Germany, the less people treated it like some sacred, untouchable text. Instead, it became a tool, a flexible narrative that writers and readers could bend and shape and use to talk about their own problems in their own time.
So all of this brings us right back to where we started, that one-star Goodreads review. After seeing Werther as a political exile and a revolutionary martyr, how in the world do we make sense of our modern take on him as just a nice guy?
Well, the idea of grafting shows us that our modern take isn't actually wrong. It's just the latest graft. We're reading this story through our own 21st century cultural lens, with all our ideas about dating and personal boundaries and emotional health. Our nice guy reading is just the newest little shoot growing in this massive 250-year-old Werther nursery.
So, what's the big takeaway here? The Sorrows of Young Werther is so much more than just an old book. It gave us a language for the sheer intensity of youth and sorrow. It created the blueprint for the passionate, tortured romantic hero. But I think most importantly, it's the perfect case study in how stories live. It proves that a story's meaning is never set in stone. Its real power isn't in the original plot, but in its absolutely endless capacity to be reborn.
Which kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What are the big, defining stories of our time? And how will future generations graft them onto their own worlds, transforming them into something that we might not even recognize?